Um, Sunshine, no rain? Okay, good. Rain, lots of rain in Oregon, so we'll hope it'll stay sunny for you while you're here at least. Yeah. So Dr. Noyes was here about 8 years ago and did this same series, but now it's been 8 years. I'm sure he's got some updates. And how many of you caught last time? Were you here, Candy? No? Oh, good. Okay. Or if you did, it was been 8 years, right? Yeah, and it takes some thinking about and pondering to go, wow, this whole topic is really pervasive in our society, and understanding the concepts is really important. Dr. Noyes is a graduate of Loma Linda University and had a special interest in preventive medicine and nutrition for 45 years. For the past 20 years, he's been speaking on this subject, traveling around the world. He's authored 3 books on the topic, and I'm looking forward to hearing all he has to say. Welcome, Dr. Noyes.
Thank you. I'm going to be comfortable. I want you to feel free to stop me at any place if I am not clear or there's a question that's important that others would be helpful to them for me to answer too. Being a small group, I think you'll feel a little easier doing that than if the church was full. So that is fine. The title of our presentation tonight is Alternative and Mystical Healing Therapies. That's the title of the today, tomorrow, and Sunday. This evening's program is the story of our health message. I have been for 20 years presenting seminars on the topic of these alternative and mystical healing therapies. And I didn't quite finish the title. The rest of that title was, Are They Medically Sound and Spiritually Safe? That's the question. There's a lot of belief in them. They have swept across the West like a tsunami in interest. They have infected our church everywhere. And so we want to look today, tomorrow, to see, is it something that each of us would choose to use or not? And what I wish to do with you is to share with you what I have learned. I spent 20 years trying to determine the nature of these things. I did not use them. I did not prescribe them for my patients. I discouraged them, but I didn't have a good reason. I didn't have the absolute confidence. What are they? It looked at times like they were marvelous. Medical science was inspecting them as to whether something accomplished or not. Everything was judged. If somebody got better consistently, there was improvement, then they would consider them valuable. But I had another dimension that I wanted to be sure about, and is that, were they spiritually safe? Not just did people improve, were there things better? But before we get into those, I want us to take this evening and look at what God has given the Seventh-day Adventist people in the way of health advice, health directions. We can come at this point and say it's the best in the world, without question, scientifically proven. For 150 years, we didn't have that ability to have that background of the research that we have today that proves it. But because we believed, maybe 50% or so followed the program quite closely, and others to some degree. And even the number that did has made the denomination stand out in the whole world in the health message. And so this is an important point that I want to bring. First, it was from God that gave to us this message. It wasn't from a lady. She was the conduit. She had no knowledge of these things at all, but God gave them to her. I have absolute confidence and belief in this. Now let's take a look at the story of our Seventh-day Adventist health message. I was fortunate in my freshman year of medical school to have a class conducted by D.E. Robinson. He had been Mrs. White's personal secretary for 15 years. And he wrote a book. He went back and researched the history of the movement of the health message from the very initial vision, the initial information God gave, on through. And that little book is in your ABC, The Story of Our Health Message by D.E. Robinson. So much that I'm giving you this evening will be coming from that book. That class, I look back with great satisfaction that I had that privilege of listening to him to present that message. And that was back in 1955. So let us proceed here. Going way back in ancient times, 3000 BC and so forth, there are secular writings that have been found. And we can see that early on, there was some understanding, some reasonable understanding between disease and its cause and man's relationship to it. Early on, there was some sensible knowledge. Then as we went further along and came up about the 1500 BC, at the time of the Exodus of the children of Israel, and this is true not only in Egypt, but in India, in Mesopotamia, other places, that somewhat reasonable knowledge of what caused disease and personal hygiene and public hygiene had been lost sight of. Now everything was a mystical concept. And so as we look at the writings, the papyrus writings of Egypt, which outline their diseases, outline their approaches to it, it was all mystical, had no reasonable sense from cause to effect. What happened? As mankind separates himself from the knowledge of God, his medical practice goes down. You will see this through history. And I want that to be something to be understood today, tomorrow, and so forth. Now, God gave to the children of Israel through Moses, as they traveled through the desert, some principles of hygiene, principles of lifestyle. We call them the Mosaic principles. However, they came from God. And they were, we would call them rational. Not mystical, but rational. They made sense as we understand disease, as we understand physiology. But at that day, they did not understand that, but God gave them that. And the principles of those very concepts that was given to them in the desert by God are the standards of public health for the world today. Separation from disease, cleanliness. They were to go outside the camp for their excrement and dig a hole and fill up, and a variety of things. We won't go into them. But God gave that at a time when that was totally not understood and wasn't practiced. Simple principles, extremely simple, but valuable because it had relationship to disease and disorders. The Egyptian practices, they haven't stood the test of time, where that which God gave through Moses is still valuable today, those principles. Very important thing to remember. I'm going through this because as we gain a concept, a belief, a confidence that God really did something for us, then as we look at the counterfeit, it's easier to see, wow, what are we looking at that one for? That's my purpose. God said, if you diligently heed the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight, give ear to his commandments, and to keep all his statutes, I will put none of these diseases upon you, which I have brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who blesses you. It mentions commandments there. Now, this was given before the 10 Commandments were given. So what commandments is he referring to? Well, he's given them statutes and directions of their lifestyle and what they're to do. So he's talking about all advice that God has blessed his people with, not just those 10 commandments, although they cover everything, our relationship to God and our relationship to fellow men. Sure. Now this advice was given. Remember, as they came to the desert, they came to a place where there was water. But what was wrong with the water? It was bitter. Moses said, cut down a bush and throw the bush into the water. Now, do you think that bush corrected the water? His willing to do what God said is what made the difference. The bush had nothing to do with it. But this is when this was said after that. Deuteronomy 8:4, your garments did not wear out on you, nor did your feet swell those 40 years. Wow. Psalms 105:37, and there was none feeble among their tribes. God blessed them as they were willing to follow. Now we come down to the early Christian. Jesus had been on earth. He had returned to heaven. And then there was a movement for the first century, increased knowledge of salvation through Jesus Christ. And mankind was blessed with extra knowledge in health and healing. There are books and records showing that there was considerable advancement in the knowledge of health and healing for the first century or 2 centuries, writings by some of the early church fathers who were physicians. And then there was a change. The change came about in the early part of Christianity in the 3rd, 4th centuries as Christianity began to blend in with paganism. And the spirit, the soul, so-called, the pagans separated the soul from the physical body. We put it all together as one. But they said the soul lives on. It has immortality, and there's the physical body. So the physical body didn't count for anything as far as they were concerned. And so cleanliness and all of these different things that we know are important were discarded. And I won't go into the depths of some of that. But it was degradation. The cities were foul. Then we come at the period of the Dark Ages, where what little bit was known in Western Europe of health and healing, and through physicians and a bit of surgery, the church outlawed it. Literally outlawed under the pain of death, surgery, and medical therapy. All disease by this time now was considered to be mystical. It was, you were being possessed. And so this is where the practice of the exorcism came about. If you had illness, you were to go to the priest, to the temple or the sanctuary, and have exorcism. Last evening, I was in a motel, and I turned on the TV, and there they were reviewing the lead exorcist of the Vatican. And they were having a meeting this weekend. 200 of the Catholic exorcists were coming together. Very interesting. And they were talking about pure possession, which I'm sure is there on that score. And this is what they did back in those days. Now, we know that there are positions of possession, but not every illness is a spirit possession. We would agree with that, I believe. Then, as they became more and more adamant about no medicine, no surgical procedures, they outlawed it under the pain of death. And to save what knowledge there was, many physicians, the Jewish physicians and the Christian physicians, moved to Baghdad, or in the country now of Iraq, and on to India. And in that part of the world, the knowledge was preserved as they advanced more in the knowledge of surgery and so forth. And it wasn't till the Renaissance that they began to come back and bring this information back to the medical world. And at the time, the early days of our church, we had a problem with having pretty much the same knowledge in this country, and the physicians of this country, same knowledge as they did down through the Dark Ages. It wasn't any better. And so at the time, this period of time, the mid-1800s, the knowledge of general chemistry was pretty much vacant. A few places, few universities had a little knowledge. Physics was just beginning to be picked up and be a science. The knowledge of physical physiology was really very rudiment, if any. But there began to be changes. The knowledge of Christ, the 1830s, 1840s, began to come in. And whenever we begin to see an advance in the knowledge of salvation through the merits of the shed blood of Jesus Christ, we are blessed with other knowledge. And so we see a beginning to move forward. And doctors would gather together to try to understand things. But they did not have a knowledge of the basic sciences. And that's what it took eventually to crack the code. But to change and make it advance. But early on, with such lousy and terrible treatments that were administered and a misunderstanding of what caused disease, there were a few reformers here and there. One of the early reformers was a young man over in Austria by the name of, well, let's go back a little bit here. We'll get to there. But let's talk about the water, and then we'll get to the water later on Vincent. If you had a fever, high temperature, you would be put in a dark room with no fresh air, no water, hot, and this was the way you dealt with somebody with a fever. And there would be toxic substances, and these Mrs. White refers to as drugs. Mercury, antimony, and similar type of heavy metals. She has a place where she was asked by a medical student, what do you mean by drugs? Do you mean these things that I mentioned, mercury, antimony, and a variety of others? And she says, yes, there are simpler ones that are not so harmful, but eventually you'll learn to do without any of them. But when the word drug was used, it was referring to these things we don't use and understand now. And the others were called simples. And mixes on that part. So, but this is, caused such consternation. And she said, but this should not cause division. But it has, because people have hung on to it. These are things we don't use. And at that time, they didn't understand disease, and that's the reason they used them. They didn't understand germs. Here we have a picture of bacteria that have been stained. The red things are white blood cells, and the bacteria are little streptococci. They didn't understand that. They didn't understand the hygiene of keeping cleanliness of house and home and clothing and bathing and so forth. All foreign things. Dealing with human waste was not dealt with well. Nutrition was, if you can remember the winter times, how do you preserve nice fresh radishes and carrots and all of these things? It was difficult. And so they'd pickle them. And they would salt the meats and so forth. And many of the methods of preservation we know now cause problems themselves, severe. The pickling of fruits and vegetables, certainly a big source behind cancer of stomach, cancer of esophagus, and so forth. And the countries that still do a lot of that in the smoking of meats. So the preservation was important. High salt, barbecuing and fried smoked pickled food, all of these things, the frequent use of tobacco and alcohol, the frequent drinking of the coffee and tea. And what we didn't also pay much attention to is 7 days a week, 12 hours a day or more working without that seventh day off or a few hours in the evening to enjoy life. Now, another thing that was a pattern in these early days of our church, it was a status symbol to have white bread. Over in the Orient, it was a status symbol to have white rice, polished rice. Only the rich could afford it. The others had to take the brown or the whole grain. But we'll see here later, the second vision given on health referred to this very practice. Now, the medical treatment at that time basically was worthless. Mostly it was harmful. Sometimes actually was the cause of death itself. Not understanding the cause of disease. There was a philosophy. That philosophy they had, we'll deal more with tomorrow as we understand the counterfeit system that the devil has brought along and is sharing with the world today instead of God's system built upon his physical laws. With medical treatment so poor, then alternative approaches appeared effective. There were some that come along and did certain things, and what they didn't do was give those harmful mercury, antimony, arsenic, and so forth, and gave them better nutrition and dealt with them, gave them water. And then they would maybe give some other something and give all of the credit to some little concoction they prepared and give the credit. They got better because they stayed away from the bad treatment. They did what we recognize as reasonable, but the practice of what's called homeopathy was one of these things. It would take a substance, dilute it down to maybe there was nothing even left of the original substance, and then give it, and this was a cure-all. Homeopathy, 200 years of that, still being done today as a wonder drug. But that man didn't like these other drugs. He gave them good diet. He gave them cleanliness of home, which was great. But he gave the credit to this substance. He says this substance had a spirit in it. And he was treating him with the spirit. And we'll get into that more tomorrow. But this gives you an idea how some alternative that may have had some good aspects to it, but then unfortunately some little aspect got the credit which had no part to play. Well, there was this young man over in Austria, and he ran into some water therapy. Back in about 1877 there, or 1777, a man at sea, a doctor at sea, had a shipload of typhus, and then was the practice to put the typhus patients in the bottom of the ship where it was hot, no fresh air, no water, nothing, and this would be their therapy. There were some men dying that were so miserable, they begged to be put up on deck and to pour water on them because they're going to die anyway. So the doctor says, well, since they're dying, we'll do that. But they're the ones that got well by cooling them and dealing with them. And so he wrote this up and spread, but doctors at sea couldn't accept it. It just didn't fit into their concept of disease and its cause. So that kind of got lost. And then this Vincent Presnitz, as a boy in Austria in 1812, he found that using cold water under certain circumstances, had a sprained wrist, using cold water, the pain was reduced, and so forth. And he went forward, and eventually he had an organization, and people came from around the world to his water treatments. And that was at a period of time where Ellen White and James White got sick, and they went to a certain place in New York for water therapies. And probably the doctor there was following through on Presnitz's system. And so water had its place. Didn't cure everything, but it sure was a good thing and was useful. So the hydrotherapy came out of that. Then in about 1830s, there was a gentleman, I believe God gave him a message. He gave him the message he gave this company of believers, the Adventist. This man was Sylvester Graham. And you ever heard of graham crackers and graham bread? The school where Billy Graham graduated was the university that this man, Sylvester Graham, started. They were a vegetarian. I'm trying to think of the name of that school. It's ongoing today, university. But to me, when I've looked over what they were given, it was the message that we were given. Eventually it lost its way and the school went away. But it was given even before the message came to this body, Sylvester Graham. And that was, I believe, a God-given message for the people. In the mid-1800s, one of the leading educators says it was time to start teaching some of our students something about health, their life. And so they began to be in the public schools, or the schools were mostly the religious ones then, but they began to be there, a knowledge of teaching some proper way of living, some lifestyle. And then there was the great disappointment of 1844. And after that, a small group of people, convinced still that they weren't totally wrong in their understanding of the Bible, continued to study. And you know this story. For 11 years they studied and began to realize more of the doctrines of the Bible. And Ellen White, of course, was one of those members. And during this time, as they were still studying in 1848, this is 4 years after the disappointment, she received a message. And interesting, the things that this message contained. 3 things. Stay away from the tobacco, coffee, tea. Why? Weren't there a lot of other things horrible in their lifestyle that were worse than these? I've often wondered about that. Nowadays, medicine is promoting coffee and tea as being something wondrous. But my faith is in what God said. That's where I stay. They affect the way they think. And this was the real reason, I think, early on. Those things, if they're dealing and trying to understand the Bible, these components alter a bit the thinking process. Last year I took a 3-day course in the science of the brain, nutrition, and so forth. And just recently I had a 3-day seminar that I attended on international nutrition and the plant food. And it all comes down, these things, now we have the proof behind how it affects the way we think, our diet, our way we live. Then this tobacco business in the church. Here's a quotation. I have seen in vision that tobacco was a filthy weed, that it must be given up and laid aside or given up. Said my accompanying angel, if this is an idol, it is high time it was given up. And unless it is given up, the frown of God will be upon the one that uses it, and he cannot be sealed with the seal of God. I think we want to look at the things that God has told us in the past and said, if God said it, that's good enough for me. Because if we want to quibble and let science be our direction, we're going to make a mistake. But these things affect the brain, how we think, what we choose to do, and so forth. But what's so interesting, how long it took. It took 15 years for tobacco to be put out of the church. Now, nobody was suddenly ostracized or disfellowshipped because within the 6 months or so they didn't stop. It was a working process to work with the people, because God recognized what he was bringing people out of. And at a certain point, they give up and take off. This was so because there were a few nice, loyal, energetic, intelligent people that read the Bible, and they learned about the pig. And it says, the Bible says, no, let's not use it. And they begin to agitate. But God sent a special message. Leave it alone. He'll bring that in at his time. That there's certain things at a certain point that the body of believers wasn't ready to handle. And so that was, to me, very interesting. And it should give us a little more confidence as we read God's message. Now, here's the second health vision, 1854. And what was it about? three things. One, cleanliness of home, surroundings, and body. People didn't take a bath months apart sometimes. You know, we have the showers, we have things different, running water. They didn't have that. What a difference. Because it's just almost unheard of for people that we know and live around us that don't get a bath, that don't follow these patterns of being clean. You just don't feel good. But that had to be told. And to avoid the use of grease. And grease was animal fat. Mostly lard, but there would be beef lard also. Now, I've traveled a lot in Eastern Europe and in Ukraine and in Russia. You go to the meat market, it's out on the street sometimes. Huge tables full of lard, chunks, you buy a chunk. People just eat it straight. And in the German army during World War II, they were partitioned or given a certain ration of lard each day as a part of their rations of food. That's customary. A lot of these places, I'd be there in the winter, and so things would be outside and cold and frozen. But even when it wasn't, there would be just large tables full of chunks of lard that you would buy, and people just ate it straight. So this early on, we had information about the animal fats that today is not a new subject to us at all. We've all heard much about that. Then there was a third component. So we had first the cleanliness of body, surroundings, home, and body. 2, to avoid the grease. And then to use coarse grains, avoid the fine grain. Now, is she talking about some large kernel versus a little quinoa or a very small? I think we're looking at the refining. At that day, to refine it, they had to shake it through they would crush it first and then shake it through some silk sieves. And it was kind of expensive. And only the richer people would buy it, and it became a status symbol to be able to have white bread. That was a real treat. And in the Orient, that was a status symbol to have the white rice versus the non-polished rice. Well, those were the sources of very serious diseases in those places. But here we have, early on, 1854, advice about the whole grain. You know, medical science, the nutritional science, up till about 10, possibly some places 15 years in the past, I remember being ridiculed by some nutritionists because I mentioned we should be using the whole grain. Now it's being propagated around the world, making an emphasis of it. At this convention I attended in Loma Linda back in February, 800 scientists from 34 nations came in, the researchers in the field of nutrition, pushing the whole grains on that score. There's a verse says something about believe his prophets and your prophets prosper. All right, I saw that God was purifying unto himself a peculiar people in whom he can delight. He will have us clean and holy people. I saw that God would not acknowledge an untidy, unclean person as a Christian. Our souls, bodies, spirits are to be presented blameless to Jesus, to his Father, by Jesus to his Father. And unless we are clean in person and pure, we cannot be presented blameless to the Father. It's a rather important subject. There was the General Conference, First General Conference, 1863. 3,500 members then in the group, 21 delegates. Then 2 weeks later, there was service, a worship being held one evening, and Ellen White was there. And in that service, and in that worship service, she had another vision, the third major vision relevant to health, a very prolonged, all-encompassing vision that laid out many things. And years later, many more visions, but that began to start. And the important part here, and this I want us to remember above all else, that this message of health reform has to do with our lifestyles, and it affects our eternal destiny. And what I'm going to show tomorrow, and tomorrow afternoon, is the part that has been creeping into the church that will separate us unequivocally from life eternal if we participate, knowingly participate. I'm taking this evening to show what we've been given and the value it has done, and the world recognizes the world around. And yet, somehow creeping in, members are taking hold of the counterfeit, that which is the opposite, has no history of benefiting any mankind anywhere for any long-standing health deal. But it has infected every single church I've ever visited, and I've visited a lot of them. I've been presenting these seminars for 20 years, and I haven't even dented the problem. That's the thing that's discouraging. Message of 1860 emphasized lifestyle, and lifestyle defected our eternal destiny. I was shown again that our health reform is one branch of a great work which is benefit of people for the coming of the Lord. It is as closely connected with the third angel's message as the hand is with the body. Pretty close, intricate. He, God, designs that the great subject of health reform shall be agitated and the public mind deeply stirred to investigate. For it is impossible for men and women with all their sinful, health-destroying, brain-enerving habits to discern sacred truth through which they are to be sanctified, refined, and made fit for the society of heavenly angels in the kingdom of glory. Now, the health reform was instituted. People began to take hold of it. And in the message of 1863 and then 1865, there was advice given that a health institute should be started, so that our people were so sick of and these were young people then, they couldn't even have a general conference session once because all the young officers were sick. Tuberculosis was wiping them out. Almost 3/4 of death in the United States at that time was from tuberculosis. Just unbelievable. In 1866, the church initiated a circulation of a health journal. So now they begin to propagate it. Not everybody to come together. They could print out and send out to the people a little message of this. But they did secure a building. This is the first health institute they called the Health Reform, Western Health Reform Institute. They came. What did they do? Well, they exercised. They walked. They had their proper dietary. They had the back building there was formed for hydrotherapy, different type of treatments, and they progressed. Now, there was financial problems at times, and times it grew, and once Mr. White had to take it over because it was failing, but with time it grew. Now we have in selected messages. The way in which Christ worked was to preach the word, to relieve suffering by miraculous works of healing. But I am instructed that we cannot now work in this way, for Satan will exercise his power by working miracles, and we'll be exposing some of those miracle workings this weekend. But she says, we can't do that. Why? God's servants today could not work by the means of miracles because spurious works of healing, claiming to be divine, will be wrought. The counterfeit will come in and you won't hardly be recognized. For this reason, the Lord has marked out a way in which his people are to carry forward a work of physical healing. Combined with the teaching of the word, sanitariums are to be established. It's interesting. We'll have a comment here where it says, angels will attend the patients and the helpers and the physicians to assist in the work of restoration, so that in the end, glory will be given to God and not to the doctor, the nurses, and so forth. If you wonder sometimes, you've heard the stories of some of the miraculous changes at Weimar. Just think about it. Probably this has been the power of an angel helping. Doing things the same way I might do them from my office and I don't see the same results. So think about that. In that location, God is given the glory. Or otherwise, I have a patient and I get the glory. Even if you say, no, it's not me, it's God. And so it's an interesting thought. Health Institute as an educational center. Now we're growing. We're moving with this medical information God is giving. And as the sanitarium grew and now it begins to get popular, it spreads and gets large. And eventually they needed more physicians. And they needed more nurses. And some schools were started. But before that, they had started a public health school of 3 months. Students or young men and women would come from the different churches in, spend 3 months, and then go back to their churches to teach this lifestyle and these things that we're talking about. 3 months medical training for a doctor's degree. That training of 3 months, the other schools in the land would give credit for those 3 months toward a medical degree. Very interesting. And there was to be no novices connected. Let's go back on that. No novices were to be connected with health. They were to be able to explain on a physiological basis that made sense to the rest of the doctors that fit in with the laws of health. And we've had lots of problems there. Success came from following God's directions. Then 1866, publication of a health journal. Then the Health Reform Institute was established. Therapy, what was it? Exercise, hydrotherapy, vegetarian diet, whole grains, nuts, and nuts are so important. Boy, how science has picked that up of late. And no alcohol, tobacco, coffee, or tea. But actually science is promoting not tobacco, but alcohol, coffee, and tea are promoting now a little bit. It's interesting. But in the end, I believe God. It'll be shown. And we have evidence that it's not wise to do that. So 1866, the sanitarium opened. 1788 started a nursing school because they didn't have Christian nurses. 1883, that. And then in 1895, the School of Medicine, known as the American Medical College, opened. And this ran till about 1906, I think, was the last class on there. American Medical College, 1901, the medical and surgical sanitariums. As these graduates would finish, they would go out in various parts, especially in the southeast part of the United States. And all through the Northwest, we had a whole lot of sanitariums. So sanitariums grew up everywhere. They were in Canada, several in Canada, and up in the state of Washington and Oregon, and the only one really left up there anymore is Portland Sanitarium. But those were, and down in the south, all over those things, and schools of nursing were there. I was way back in the inlands of Russia, and I was giving this talk. I have it out in Russian, and the people in the church, I was telling them how we had, I think, 55 nursing schools at that time. Can our children go to those schools? Oh, they were just desperate. Yes, and of course, you don't want them to come to the U.S. Too much money. There's other good schools that far less cost they can go to, and they are beginning to form more in some of those places. But oh, how they wanted their students to be able to go to those schools. That was way back. It was in a province of Russia that is paganism. You hardly see even an Orthodox church. They go into the woods to worship. They worship the devil, and they have a big feast and a festival each year where they slash themselves, walk through hot fire, and so forth. There's several provinces in Russia like that. Dr. Kellogg, you've heard of him, the famous doctor, one of our early doctors that was brilliant. The Lord had blessed him. My dear brother, as I've written you before, I know that the Lord has placed you in a very responsible position, standing as you do as the greatest physician in our world. Boy, that would not be good to tell most of us. We would feel pretty, the head gets bigger. a man to whom the Lord has given understanding and knowledge, that you may do justice and reveal the true missionary spirit in the institution, which is represent truth in contrast to error. So he was blessed, and the place greatly grew. As you look to God in your critical operations, angels of God were standing by your side, and their hands were seen as your hands, performing the work with an accuracy that made the beholder surprised. Who has been by your side as you have performed these critical operations? Who has kept you calm and self-possessed in the crisis, giving you quick and sharp discernment, clear eyesight, steady nerves, skillful precision? The Lord Jesus has sent his angel to your side to tell you what to do. A hand has been laid upon your hand. Jesus, and not you, has guided the movement of your instrument. Quite a testimony, isn't it? This is reporting there is a time I have a book that I was reading that he had written at that time. In the last 160 surgeries he had one death, where the average was between 20 and 30% in most other hospitals at the time. This is the institution that grew up. It was large. Do you remember what happened to it? It burned. First, he developed the cereal industry so that people trying to get them to use more whole grains. Eventually, the cereal industry turned out to be white flour and sugar, most of them. There are still some good ones, but it's not quite what he planned for it. He worked with soybeans, but Dr. Miller, who was one of his students, went to China, and he went further with the soybean, and Dr. Miller also started Loma Linda Foods, and he gave it to the church. I must now give to my brethren the instruction that the Lord has given me in regards to the health food question. By many people, the health foods are looked upon as man's devising, but they are of God's originating as a blessing to his people. The health food work is the property of God, is not to be made a financial speculation for personal gain. It's interesting. In fact, I heard on the TV last night, it was mentioned, the night before actually, that, the country of Australia, the health food industry over there, 95% of it is, our church owns it. It's a $300+ million business, exporting to 30 different nations, those foods. And down in Brazil, I think it is, or Argentina the same, and there's Germany, there's some that they take into Russia. I was in Russia and had eating some there. The light is given, that God has given and will continue to give on the food question, is to be to his people today what the manna was to the children of Israel. The manna fell from heaven, and the people were told to gather it and prepare it to be eaten. So in the different countries of the world, light will be given to the Lord's people. Health food suited to those countries will be prepared. Not everything coming out of a health food store is necessarily so good, but you can see the early beginnings and the reason why, and with good products. But then there were storm clouds that begin to, this great history, the sanitarium was grown to a great institution of 500 beds, and people coming from Europe and the rich and famous of America coming to this institution. And then it burned. Prior to this, there had been some storm clouds, spiritual storm clouds, in the thinking of Dr. Kellogg. And this teaching that he had is the word pantheism, pantheistic concepts he had, may not mean too much to you. We'll explain more about it tomorrow. But the storm clouds of this type of thinking began to be in his mind, and Mrs. White worked with him for 15 years, writing to him, trying to get him to see. He had gotten almost half of the doctors and many of the ministers to be following in this. It's the same disguised spirit entering our church today and other methods. And we'll be dealing with that tomorrow. It's the exact same thing that we're dealing with today. Subtle Teachings, an 1899 General Conference session. This is something Doctor put in the bulletin. It gives you a little clue of his thinking. Ellen White in Australia was given in vision warnings, which were sent to the General Conference meetings in the United States about the deceptive teachings of Dr. Kellogg. They were pantheistic, God in everything. God is everything. These were pantheistic concepts of the nature and the personality of God. This theory was that God was in all substance, air, water, food, and righteousness by faith came from partaking of these substances rather than our belief and our faith. This is what was being taught. And here's what he wrote in the General Conference Bulletin. We have here the evidence of a universal presence. Now this is this pantheistic spirit that this word presence is referring to. This cosmic spirit, cosmic energy. Universal presence, an intelligent presence, an all-wise presence, an all-powerful presence, a presence by the aid of which every atom is kept in touch with every atom. This force that holds all things together, that is everywhere present, that thrills throughout the whole universe, that acts instantaneously through boundless space, can be nothing else than God himself. He's saying this is the personality of God. This power, this cosmic substance that holds together is God. God created it, but he is a being separate. God is in us and in everything. This is what he was teaching. And she told us, you adapt to that. You begin to read this and accept his teaching, and pretty soon the devil can talk directly to you. And that's what's going to be the theme of our dealing tomorrow. But it's coming through medical therapies, alternative and mystical therapy. Exact same thing. The theory that God is an essence, and that's another word for this. He whose presence. There's 100 words. Chi. You heard of chi? That's what we're talking about. The theory that God is an essence, pervading all nature, is one of Satan's most subtle devices. Misrepresents God and is a dishonor to his greatness and majesty. The burning of the sanitarium and the Review and Herald, also in this place. So Battle Creek was destroyed and they moved to D.C., but Kellogg went back and built a mammoth 100,000-bed hospital when he had been advised to build several small ones elsewhere. And so plans were made to rebuild. Ellen White advised about this, but he took his own way. He proposed to write a book on health to sell and make money to pay for the temple, for the hospital. And the book was called The Living Temple. And this book theme was akin, close to pantheism. Today we have a word, it's panentheism. Is that, yes, there is a living God. For pantheism, God is that cosmic power that goes through everything, not a living being. Panentheism is, there is this power goes through, but there's a living God and he's given us a piece of himself, divinity within. And so she says it was akin. His book had this akin to pantheistic, and that's this panentheism that we call today. And the church publishing house refused to publish it, but he had it published by another place and sold it. Selected Messages says we need not the mysticism that's in that book, The Living Temple. Those who entertain these sophistries will soon find themselves in a position where the enemy can talk to them, literally talk to them, and lead them away from God. In the book, The Living Temple, there is presented the alpha of deadly heresies. The omega will follow and will be received by those who are not willing to heed the warning God has given us. Be not deceived. Many will depart from faith, giving heed to seducing spirits, doctrines of devils. We have now before us the alpha of the danger. The omega will be a most startling nature. I believe what we're talking about tomorrow is a part of it. There's various things of spiritualism that are part of this omega. But I believe what we're going to be talking about tomorrow is definitely a component of that. That's my belief. And I've spent more than 40 years studying this subject. 20 years because I was confused, couldn't figure it out. I'm slow. And then I found a little book that gave me a clue, and it just unfolded it all right out in the open, and it was so easy then to understand. We'll present that tomorrow morning. 1,000-bed institution, 1901, the Battle Creek College moved to Bering Springs. The General Conference moved to Washington, D.C. But Kellogg kept, in spite of all of the advice and letters to him, he kept teaching that, and many of our major leading men followed with him and went out of the church. Division between the clergy and the medical leaders. In 1906, the final separation. The buildings were not in the conference name. They were in a corporation, and those were lost. Medical institution closed, and then the blessings were withdrawn in 1910. The last of medical students left there. But at the same time, down in Southern California, as this is going on, the Glendale and the Paradise Valley Institution was started. There was a small conference, Southern California, of 11,000 people, and they stepped out and started sanitariums, bought these buildings of Paradise Valley and the one in Glendale. These were resorts area that went broke, and they got them for a low price, but big, beautiful buildings, all ready to go. And here they had these two, and they were in debt on those and wondering what to do. And then there was this little lady telling them, go buy another one. And they just had it with her. But there's Paradise Valley in its early days, and Glendale Sanitarium in its early days. Very interesting, beautiful places. Okay, in 1901, she had seen in vision a place that was to be a medical institution, an educational institution. Now, in 1905, Pastor Burden out there at Loma Linda area, he found this beautiful building just like these other ones up on top of this little hill, and this was a resort that had gone broke. Had 64 rooms for patients and had many acres, 74 of them under tilling, and they had a mile of walks. They had a deep well. The train went right through the land. And she told him to buy it. It kept price coming down. He didn't have any money. Nobody gave him. She says, borrow some. So he borrowed $1,000 on his own. Put it down. And up within a few hours, 2 or 3 hours of where they're going to lose it, money came in, and it was secured. It's a story. This book, The Story of Our Health Message, has it, and you ought to get that book and read it. You know, that same thing, it's very similar to that, happened here within the last year at Loma Linda. The California state was going to close down the hospital if they did not get the money and have it secured at a certain time to build a new one that is earthquake proof. Up to about an hour or so before it was to be closed, the money came in. So he's still there. 1905, Ellen White visited Loma Linda. You know the story? She looked around. What'd she say? This is what I saw in vision. And they've formed now a statue there and so forth, a figurine with her in a carriage riding around, and this is the place she saw. And that's what it looked like. I had my meals in that place for 2 years. And there's what it looked like on the other side. I got that $40,000. And it had gone broke. But what a place. First class nursing, the baby delivered. Ellen White in 1906 talking. Medicine didn't start till 1909, but the nursing started in 1905. Medical class, doing some hydrotherapy. Now look to this lady here on your left. She's all wrapped up. She's got her foot in a hot tub there. And we're going to talk about Sunday morning, some of those things a little bit that still can be done, cheap, they're good. All the students are out Sabbath going on missionary activities. They're in their classes looking at the microscope. God was in control. 1905, the nursing school. 1909, the medical school. The training was to be of the highest order. Students have the privilege of maintaining a living connection with the wisest of all physicians, from whom there is communicated knowledge of a superior order. And then they begin to travel to the world as graduates came. Mission hospitals in various nations. There's around 180 or so hospitals now. Schools for all of the medical ancillary services, laboratory training, x-ray check. Now it's so many different things, you can't keep track of them. Then the dental school was started, the different specialties. 53, the dental school. 67, School of Public Health. And then the University of College of Medical Evangelists was called now the Loma Linda University. We have 6 medical schools in the world now. It's interesting how other places, it's good because if they come here, they hardly ever go home. And it's best for them. They start going to Mexico, and after a few years in Mexico, they went home. But you can see the money, the flow, the jobs, and there's plenty, and they've learned their specialties, they're acquainted with people, and they can go right to work, and they're deep in debt. They need to be elsewhere. So you see there the campus. This is a little hospital, a mission hospital I worked in on an island called Phuket, Thailand. This is a 50-bed hospital, and it was hard work. Downtown was our clinic, 3 miles distance from the hospital. So that's myself some years past, sewing up a cut on a lady's foot. We had a big waiting room out there that had a well right in the middle of the waiting room. And a bucket so you could dip down and bring the water up, and the sick kids got stood there, and there was a drain, and the mothers would give them hydrotherapy, cooling them as they waited to see the doctor. And there you had a large room. You'd fill the room with patients and see them one at a time. Everybody listened to everybody else. When you finished the last one, you'd fill it up again. And it was a little different from what I was used to. I'll show you some surgeries I did there, just a few. We were doing a C-section. And my son, 12 years old, was taking the picture and not holding still, so it's a little fuzzy. We got him. Here's a lady who had to amputate a leg. They have these. It's probably from the smoking and chewing the betel nut that allows these things to happen. So we got it fixed. It was the next day. Still got a scab on it there. Looks a little better, though. And the families are so happy when it comes about. On the way home, I visited in Penang, Malay. A classmate of mine or a friend from Walla Walla from medical school. He was the surgeon at this place, so I stopped to visit. And this is down at Disneyland. There's a hospital that they built, and Adventist operating. My nephew was chief of staff there, or not chief of staff, CEO, the chief operating officer. Happened to take a picture. And so we got these various hospitals. But now summarizing the benefits, what's happened with this story that God has given a people. Breakfast cereal, let's go back. Breakfast cereals. Now peanut butter wasn't first established. It was probably by the Mayans down in South America, but it was made popular. It was brought back into function through the sanitarium and Kellogg, meat substitutes, soy milk, for instance, soy milk in general. Worldwide influence, hospital administration. China, some years ago, asked to have a large group of our administrators go there and teach them how to administrate hospitals. The heart team traveled and around the world teaching doctors to do heart surgery on infants and children. Children's Heart Transplant Center, you know of that. The preventative medicine to the world, and we'll speak more of that a little bit. Hospitals were given to Adventists in this nation. They were given, the large one in China, which I visited, was given and built, and says, here, you run this and teach our doctors how. Hospitals built and given. Here is a birthday party for many of the heart transplant children. And that was the Sir Run Shaw Hospital in China. I had the opportunity to visit there. World Influence, the Stop Smoking program by Dr. McFarland and Elam Falkenberg. Vegetarianism shown to be scientifically sound and superior, primarily through the working of Dr. Harding, Dr. Register. And now we have the end results of their work ongoing. The first knowledge of cholesterol being involved with heart was shown by Dr. Harding. That was the first Adventist health study. As he got his doctoral degree at Harvard, that was his study, to show the difference between Adventist health and the non-Adventist. And he happened to separate the fats and do a cholesterol. At that time, cholesterol was only done for checking a thyroid function. I was a lab tech, and that's how I used to do them. That just wasn't thought of. But when his study came out, he showed that Adventists were just as healthy as the rest and not in trouble nutritionally, but they didn't pay attention to that. Hey, look at this, cholesterol, fat, animal fat, cholesterol, and the world was in an epidemic of heart attacks. That was our number one cause of death in our country. And so that became the great study of the scientists after that. And that was the first. There's 2, 3 more, so 4 health studies, and those are the ones that are now making the whole world, the nutritional scientists of the world, coming. And that's the ones that were coming to this, 800 of them, to the seminar 2 months ago in Loma Linda. All right. Dr. McFarland, Stop Smoking. Dr. McFarland's program and the pastor that helped him put it together, it was built upon the fact, upon the principle, that it's the power of God that we elicit to take away our habits. Not some magic thing we do and something, but the power of God. Unfortunately, it got changed, and when it got changed, it was the power within self. And I quit doing it. Mervyn Harding, first SDA, the cholesterol, we talk about that. Dr. Register, you remember these men, they used to come around everywhere and lecture camp meetings and so forth. They were great men. Now, this is looking at this Congress. This is the little booklet that they handed as you paid your dues to go. The 7th, every 5 years, International Congress of Vegetarian Nutrition. Really phenomenal. There's a picture inside. And it's held every 5 years. This was session 7, purpose, to share to the world the research on plant-based diets in relation to health and disease prevention. And these, one of the men from, I think it was from Harvard, got up and he says, here's the cause, here's our problem with disease. Here's what's behind it, our major ones. Smoking, number 1, around the world. The diet, inadequate exercise, being overweight. Those are the most fundamental principles. And you go and you'll find those in the Spirit of Prophecy without problems. Yeah. And what did they say to do? And here's what the summation of the whole program, 3 days of it. Grains, fruits, nuts, and vegetables. Oh, nuts are so important. Constitute the diet chosen by our Creator. Fruits, grains, and vegetables prepared in a simple way, free from spice and grease of all kinds. That's those animal fats. Make with milk or cream the most healthful diet. We're told the day will come we won't choose to use the milk or the cream because of potential disease of animals, and that it'll work itself out, and that can be done very easily today. And so whether a person chooses or not, I leave that up to them. Now, the life expectancy, I used to show this in Russia. You'll see there on your left the average lifespan of a Russian, 58 years of age, Russian male. The woman about 72. His working age would be about 52. Then I would point out the vegetarian Adventist over here, and we're looking at quite a difference between, that doesn't show up on there. Anyway, from the left to the right is considerable. The vegetarian would be 84 or so, the male, if he was a vegetarian for 30, 40 years. And it was a third more life than the Russian was getting. And I used to tell, I was talking to the general public at times. I did many, many seminars there, and many times just to the ministers. And they had already stopped smoking and weren't drinking. But I said, you know, what I'm telling you the next 3 days here in our seminar, you can have the experience of this on the right. And I went over there at the time that about all they had could afford to eat was white. They had white bread and potatoes. Now, the whole grain bread was the same price, but they wouldn't buy it. And the potatoes, they peeled so heavy that most of the nutrients would lose under the peeling. And so I said, you listen to what I have to share with you. And I would have the ministers of an entire conference together for 3 days. And I did for years lifestyle, nutrition, and so forth before I began to get into this subject. And I said this, and when I'd get through at the end of 3 days, showing them all of the things we have in the nutrition, you know what they tell me? This lecture, this presentation I've given you tonight, to them was the most important. They, at that time, had just come out of Zaowski, the university there, our school. They'd just been ministers a short time. They were Adventists not more than 6 to 7 years, these young men. And then it takes some training. Coming out and were just beginning to be ministers and had been taught a little bit about not eating flesh foods and meats, so forth, but really didn't have a clue where it came from or what it was about. And they said it just made a whole difference in their world, how they approached what they believed and what they were willing to accept. And so after that, I've done this many times in churches, even for church service or church Friday evening, before the main presentation of exposing these counterfeit methods of healing, so that we can look and see and be grateful that God has given us that which we need. And then when we compare and see the end results of longevity, science has backed it up, and in comes, like a tsunami, a system that has no history in the countries where it's been for 3,000 plus years of benefiting a bit, but comes into the West like it's an answer to prayer, right through the churches, and people hang right on to it. And when they investigate it scientifically and under this rigid rules, they don't find it's any stronger than a placebo effect. And that'll do wonders, though. And sometimes there is a power besides that, I believe. But where we have been given what we have, why would we turn to that which has no history of it? It just makes me sick. And this is why for 20 years I've been sharing this message. Now, many people disagree with what I present, and that's their privilege. I only share what I learned. And I got into this because I couldn't understand what was coming on, and nobody knew anything more about it than I did, but I kept studying and studying. And finally I found that which gave me a much more basic concept of out of which it arose. And then it was all clear. And tomorrow we have the privilege of sharing that with you, and to God be the glory. Thank you and if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to try to answer them. I never promise that I have the answer. But has anything come to your mind, a question? I just hope and count on everybody that I share this with to, at their best ability and at proper time, share with others, because it's such a huge amount of people that need to know. And it's more being born than I'm able, every day that I'm able to share with. Shall we stand and we'll have benediction? Our Father in heaven, we are grateful for this privilege of looking at the history of your leading among this people. We've made mistakes. We will make more. But we know that as we come to the foot of the cross, our sins and our mistakes will be forgiven. And we ask for that power from on high to guide us, to keep us from more mistakes, that we may choose wisely, that our characters will be built, that we may be able to go through the time of the end and stay true to the God of the universe. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you all for coming.